After performing in a 1988 dance recital, 8-year-old twin sisters vanish without a trace, leaving a devastated family and a community frozen in grief. Nearly a decade later, during renovations of the now-abandoned theater, a child's recital costume and a pair of tiny ballerina shoes are found tucked away in a dusty attic, triggering a renewed investigation into a mystery that was never truly buried. The old Grand Aurora Theater had been silent for nearly a decade, its grand velvet curtains stiff with dust, the chandeliers hanging like frozen memories above cracked wooden floors. But on a muggy June morning in 1997, a pair of renovation workers climbed into the attic with flashlights and boxes, expecting only cobwebs and forgotten props. What they found instead was a small velvet-covered trunk tucked behind a stack of broken stage flats, its clasp rusted, its color faded to a dull burgundy. Inside were two identical costumes, child-sized, delicate pink tulle with sequined bodices that shimmered faintly in the sunlight that filtered through a broken skylight. Resting on top of the folded tutus were a pair of tiny ballerina slippers, still bearing the faint imprint of little feet. One of the workers reached down and gently lifted a shoe, then froze. Tucked beneath the satin ribbon was a charm bracelet, silver tarnished but still legible. 5 tiny letters dangled from the chain, M-A-R-L-I-E. The name jolted the foreman like a slap. He stepped back, staring at the contents of the trunk as if they might vanish if he blinked. "Call someone," he muttered. "Call the police, right now." News spread fast. Within hours, the theater, long closed since funding ran dry in the early 90s, was surrounded by cruisers, crime scene tape, and quiet speculation. When Detective Elena Rivas arrived, the air was heavy with humidity and old grief. The box had been photographed, dusted, and left untouched. She leaned over it, staring into the past like it might offer an answer. She remembered the headlines. Everyone did. June 11, 1988. The night Marley and Tessa Greer, 8-year-old twins, performed their final duet at the town's annual children's recital and were never seen again. For 9 years, the town of Aurora Falls had lived with the wound. Parents held their children tighter. The theater shut down. The Greer family disappeared from public life. The investigation turned cold. Until now. Rivas stood in the attic's gloom, her hand hovering over the tiny shoes. Nothing in this box should have still existed, and yet here it was, like someone had placed it there deliberately. She whispered aloud, barely audible, "Where did you girls go?" It had been a warm Saturday night in June 1988, the kind of evening where the sky held onto its golden hue just a little longer, and the townspeople of Aurora Falls gathered at the Grand Aurora Theater for their favorite tradition, the annual children's recital. The marquee glowed proudly. Hearts in motion, a night of dance, as families poured through the old doors, laughing, fanning themselves with printed programs, finding their seats before the velvet curtain rose. Backstage, the energy was electric. Little girls tugged at sequins, boys fidgeted with bow ties, and teenage helpers tried to keep them all lined up and quiet. Marley and Tessa Greer stood hand in hand in matching pink tutus, their dark hair coiled into neat buns, smiles wide with anticipation. It was their 3rd recital, but their first duet, one Marley had insisted they call the Butterfly Song. They'd practiced in the living room for weeks, giggling when one of them spun too fast or missed a beat. Their mother, Dina, sat in the front row that night, her eyes fixed on the stage even before the lights dimmed. When her girls appeared under the spotlight, everything else melted away. They moved in sync, twirling like mirror images, the crowd charmed by their grace and the soft innocence of childhood. When it ended, the applause was thunderous. Dina had stood to clap, laughing with tears in her eyes. She never imagined that would be the last time she saw her daughters. By the time the final bows were taken and families began collecting their children backstage, the Greer twins were gone. Dina waited near the side entrance, then the dressing room, her smile faltering as each group of kids passed without her girls. 5 minutes turned into 15. She asked a volunteer, then a second. "Have you seen Marley and Tessa?" Someone thought they went to the bathroom. Another claimed they'd seen them heading toward the prop room. But no one was certain. Panic bloomed behind Dina's ribs as she moved from room to room, calling their names, voice tightening with each shout. The lights were shutting down. Parents were leaving with sleepy children in their arms. But Dina Greer stayed, still searching. The twins were nowhere. And the theater had gone quiet. The call came in at 9:42 p.m. Missing children. Grand Aurora Theater. 2 females, age 8. Officers Jack Delmore and Karen Wu were the first on scene, barely out of their cruisers before Dina Greer was at their side, shaking, breathless, clutching a recital program crumpled in her fist. "They were just here," she kept saying. "They were just on stage. They said they'd wait backstage for me." Within 20 minutes, the theater transformed from a celebratory hub to a crime scene. Staff were told to stay put. The remaining families were questioned. Dina sat on a bench in the lobby, her makeup smudged, fingers digging into her knees, whispering her daughter's names like a prayer. Someone brought her water. She didn't drink it. By 11 p.m., search efforts extended beyond the building. Officers scoured the alleys, the parking lot, and the rear loading docks where theater equipment was often moved in and out. A dog team was requested from the next county over. Nothing. Inside, police focused on the back corridors and prop rooms. The Grand Aurora was a maze of narrow staircases and tucked-away closets, a place that had grown over the decades with additions and patchwork repairs. A building with blind spots and shadows. One officer later called it a rabbit warren of dead ends. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no blood. A backstage door was found slightly ajar, but that could have meant anything or nothing. 2 conflicting witness reports emerged. An elderly usher claimed she'd seen the girls leaving with a tall man in a gray suit. "Maybe a relative?" she offered. Another teenager working the costume table swore she saw the twins near the prop storage room around 8:45, giggling and chasing each other like they always did. Neither account could be verified. The police worked through the night. Volunteers joined with flashlights. A nearby creek was searched. A pair of pink ribbons was found in the bushes by the west exit, but they didn't match anything Dina recognized. By dawn, the only thing that remained was an unbearable silence. 2 children had vanished inside a building full of people, and no one saw them leave. The morning after the recital, Aurora Falls woke to news that felt impossible. Twin girls, gone. No explanation, no witnesses. It spread like wildfire, from hurried whispers at the diner to gasps inside the church foyer. Parents kept their children close. Strangers eyed one another with suspicion. The Grand Aurora Theater, once the pride of Main Street, now stood beneath a growing shadow. Dina and her husband, Mark, gave their first statements around 7 a.m., surrounded by tired officers and the bitter aroma of old coffee. Mark's voice cracked when he described walking through the darkened backstage area, calling out their names again and again, hoping to hear even a giggle in return. Dina could barely speak. She kept reaching into her coat pocket for something, finally pulling out 2 crumpled hairbands, one pink, one lavender. She clutched them like they might help reverse time. By that afternoon, the FBI was contacted. A missing child was tragic. 2, at the same time from a crowded event with no evidence of exit? That was something else entirely. Agents arrived the next day and began reconstructing the night, moment by moment. They took photos of the stage, the dressing rooms, the exit doors. They recorded interviews with over 40 people, students, parents, volunteers, custodial staff. Still, nothing fit together. Flyers went up across the county, side-by-side school photos of Marley and Tessa, their brown eyes bright, cheeks full, one always leaning slightly into the other. Dina begged the media to keep their faces in the public eye. "Someone knows something," she said into the microphones, trying to sound strong. For a week, helicopters combed the surrounding woods. Drones were still a decade away, so officers walked mile after mile of terrain on foot. A drained retention pond turned up nothing but a rusted bicycle and a broken bench. Meanwhile, the theater remained closed to the public. Police tape fluttered across its grand entryway, and inside, the scent of dust and old wood mixed with quiet dread. People began to say it aloud. It was like they vanished into thin air. And in many ways, that's exactly how it felt. One moment they were dancing under the lights. The next, gone, leaving behind only echoes and questions. The room at the end of the hall remained untouched. 9 years after the recital, after the headlines faded and the last press van rolled out of town, Denna Greer still couldn't bring herself to change a single thing in her daughter's bedroom. The twin beds, one with a faded strawberry print quilt, the other with pastel stars, were still made. The bookshelf still held their favorite picture books, worn at the corners from tiny hands flipping pages. A glow-in-the-dark moon still clung stubbornly to the ceiling, though it no longer glowed. She dusted every Saturday. Sometimes she'd open the closet just to breathe in the faint, lingering scent of their childhood, lavender shampoo, construction paper, the gentle sweetness of innocence. The room had become sacred, a space she guarded like a museum curator, terrified that if she altered even one thing, the girls might come home and not recognize it. Mark hadn't been able to do the same. He'd lasted less than a year in the house before moving into a rental on the other side of town. Grief had wedged between them like a boulder, too heavy to lift. They loved each other, still, but that love was buried beneath 9 years of silence and diverging grief, Dina clinging to memory, Mark trying to survive by letting go. Every holiday was a minefield, every birthday passed in hushed tones. Neighbors tried at first cards, casseroles, invitations, but eventually even the kindest efforts thinned out. No one knew what to say anymore. Aurora Falls had moved on, in the way small towns do. But for Dina, time had stopped the moment the lights dimmed on that stage. She had become a kind of ghost in her own life, present, but not entirely there. She went to work. She answered questions when asked. But her eyes always drifted, scanning crowds, glancing at children's faces with unconscious yearning. Once, she'd followed a girl across a grocery store aisle, heart pounding, only to see the child turn and smile at someone else's mother. Still, every now and then, she dreamed of them. In those dreams, they were always wearing pink, always holding hands, always just out of reach. And she always woke up whispering the same thing, "Come home." In the early days, there were leads, or at least things that looked like them. 3 weeks after the girls vanished, a woman in western Nebraska called the Aurora Falls police, claiming she'd seen 2 young girls at a roadside rest stop, one with a pink tutu peeking from under her coat, the other carrying what looked like a stuffed swan. Detectives rushed out to follow up. It wasn't them. A month later, a man in Wichita mailed in a Polaroid with no return address. It showed 2 girls in a nondescript motel room, sitting on a bed, eyes wide, unsmiling. The photo was grainy and dark. One girl had dark hair, the other strawberry blonde. The photo was sent to the FBI and analyzed. Neither child matched the Greer twins. Every time the phone rang, Dina's heart tried to prepare for both answers at once, hope and devastation. Each time it was neither, the ache only grew sharper. There were letters, too. Most were kind, filled with prayers and encouragement. Others were cruel, accusing Dina of neglect or worse. A few were chilling anonymous messages claiming the girls were taken for a reason or that they had been chosen. The worst of them arrived 6 months after the recital. A postcard from St. Louis. It had no return address, only a photo of a puppet theater and a message scribbled in red ink, "We never left the stage." That one Dina gave straight to the FBI. Years passed, and the calls stopped coming. The case file swelled to 3 binders thick, filled with photographs, interview transcripts, and a map full of colored pins that went nowhere. By 1991, The leads had gone cold. By 93, the task force had dissolved entirely. All that remained were the occasional updates mailed to Dina, thin envelopes stamped with the words, "No new developments." But still, every year on June 11th, Dina walked to the locked front doors of the Grand Aurora Theater and laid 2 pink roses on the steps. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't wait around. She simply left the flowers, one for each daughter, and went home. And in the windows above, the dusty curtains never moved. They had their own language. Marley and Tessa Greer weren't just sisters, they were reflections, pieces of a whole, 2 halves that always seemed to move as one. They shared everything: a room, clothes, secrets, and the rhythm of each other's thoughts. Even their teachers said they had a way of communicating without words: a glance, a nod, a small squeeze of the hand. Marley was louder, quicker to speak, quicker to act. She was the one who always insisted they go first during rehearsals, the one who picked the pink tutus for the recital, convinced that butterflies were happier in pink. Tessa was quieter, more thoughtful, often a beat behind but never far. She could mimic any dance step perfectly after watching it once. Her teachers called it a gift. Marley called it magic. At home, they made up songs, scribbled stories in spiral notebooks, built pillow forts in the living room, and swore they were secret castles. They had a ritual before bed, brushing each other's hair while humming the theme from their favorite cartoon, then flipping a coin to decide who would tell the night's story. Their parents often found them asleep in the same bed, curled toward one another like mirror images. But as close as they were, they each had fears. Tessa hated the dark. Marley hated being alone. They both hated the prop room at the back of the theater, a cramped, windowless space where broken mannequins and dusty backdrops were kept. They whispered once that it smelled like old glue and secrets. On recital nights, they refused to go in there without holding hands. The last time anyone saw them, truly saw them, was in the hallway just outside that room. A volunteer costume helper, just 16 at the time, later told police the girls had been skipping in the hallway, laughing, Marley leading, as always. Then a man passed by, tall, wearing something gray, and they stopped. The helper had looked away for only a moment to fix a crooked hanger. When she turned back, the girls were gone. She never saw where they went, just heard the echo of small footsteps fading down the corridor. And after that, silence. The diary wasn't something anyone expected to matter. It was just a slim, lavender notebook with a cracked spine found buried in a box of school papers the Greers had packed away after the investigation first began. Dina came across it one cold January afternoon in 1990, almost 2 years after the disappearance. She had been sorting through the attic, preparing to move out of the house she could no longer bear to live in, when she saw the name written in glitter pen across the front. Marley's stuff. Do not read. Inside were scribbled notes, childish doodles, and snippets of songs she'd made up with Tessa. Most of it was harmless, innocent. A list of favorite ice cream flavors. A drawing of the 2 of them riding unicorns. But tucked between pages about school and dance practice was one entry that stopped Dana's breath. April 17, me and Tess saw the Candy Man again. He was in the curtain room after class. He said we were his stars. Told us not to tell or we'd get in trouble. But he gave Tess a gumdrop and said it was our secret. I don't like him. I think he lives in the wall. Dina sat down hard on the attic floor, the notebook trembling in her hands. The Candy Man. She'd never heard the name before. Not from the girls, not from the police interviews, not from anyone. She took the journal straight to the detective still assigned to the case. They photocopied it, cataloged it, and promised to follow up. A week later, she called for an update. No one had turned anything up. No known staff or volunteers had used that nickname. No registered offenders in the area matched the description. The entry was dismissed as imaginative children playing make-believe. But Dina knew her daughter, knew the tone in those words, knew the way Marley's letters leaned harder into the page when she was scared. She begged them to look again, to question everyone who had access backstage that night. The answer was always the same. We're doing everything we can. But everything wasn't enough. Because somewhere in that theater, Marley had met someone who gave her candy, called her a star, and told her to keep a secret. And after that, she was gone. The Grand Aurora Theater closed quietly in the fall of 1992, its final performance, a half-attended production of Our Town, staged by the local high school. By then, most families in Aurora Falls no longer brought their children there. The magic was gone. The red velvet seats felt haunted. The polished floors creaked with the weight of something unsaid. And beneath it all lingered the question no one could answer. What happened to the Greer twins? Funding dried up. Volunteers stopped showing up. The town council voted unanimously to shutter the building indefinitely, citing maintenance issues and declining interest. But everyone knew why. The theater had become a monument to loss. After the doors were locked and the lights went dark, the building seemed to sink deeper into itself. Ivy crept up the stone walls. Rain found its way through the roof. Inside, dust settled over abandoned props and forgotten costumes. A grand chandelier, once the pride of the lobby, hung motionless above an empty foyer, its crystals dulled with time. The box office window, once alive with chatter and ticket stubs, reflected only silence. In the years that followed, rumors grew. Teenagers dared each other to sneak in after dark. Some said they heard tapping from behind the walls. Others claimed they saw lights flicker in the dressing rooms or glimpsed two small shadows on the main stage, holding hands before vanishing into the wings. It became a place of dares and whispers, where truth blurred with grief and imagination. Denna never joined the conversations. She never stepped foot inside again. But once a year, she drove past the boarded-up entrance and parked across the street, eyes fixed on the arched windows above. She didn't need to go in. She remembered every corner, every seat, every backstage corridor. She saw it all when she closed her eyes. She knew the theater hadn't taken her daughters. A building doesn't choose who disappears, but it had held their last moments, their last dance, their final trace. And for 9 years, it had also held the one thing no one ever thought to search for. A box, tucked into an attic. Waiting. The attic hadn't been touched in years. Not really. A few volunteers had poked around back in '93 when the town briefly considered turning the Grand Aurora into a community center. But after one man fell through a rotted board and broke his ankle, they locked it up and left it alone. In 1997, a nonprofit from Kansas City stepped in with a bold idea: restore the theater, reopen it as a cultural arts hub, bring life back to Main Street. The town council agreed, eager for something, anything, to change the narrative Aurora Falls had carried for nearly a decade. Work began in June. It was slow going. Mold had crept through the lower levels, windows were cracked, and much of the wiring was decades out of code, but it was the attic no one wanted to touch. It was cramped, stifling, and worse, people said it felt wrong. One contractor joked about the ghosts of Recital past. No one laughed. On the 5th day of cleanup, 2 workers, Gregory Allen and Martin Ruiz, were tasked with clearing out the attic. The air was thick with insulation dust and the smell of dry rot. They used headlamps to navigate the maze of forgotten furniture, old set pieces, and boxes warped by time. That's when Greg spotted the velvet box. It was wedged behind an overturned rack of costume gowns and a stack of broken risers. It didn't look like much, just a small chest with brass hinges and a faded clasp. But something about it made him pause. When he opened it, dust lifted into the air like smoke. Inside, 2 pink Recital costumes lay folded with eerie precision. Sitting on top, a pair of tiny ballerina slippers, their satin yellowed but still intact. Martin leaned in, silent. "Why are these up here?" he finally asked, as if the room itself might answer. Greg didn't speak. His eyes were fixed on a small silver charm bracelet nestled between the shoes. 5 letters dangled from the chain, spelled out in soft pink enamel. M-A-R-L-I-E. They didn't touch anything else. Greg backed away and reached for his phone. Downstairs, the stage was still under construction, but above them, in the attic, the past had just cracked open. And it was still breathing. The bracelet was enough to stop the world for a moment. Detective Elena Rivas stood beneath the flickering attic bulb, the velvet box open at her feet. She wore gloves, but still handled the items with reverence, as though any wrong movement might disrupt something sacred. The costumes, though dulled with age, were unmistakable, perfectly matched to the ones from the 1988 Recital photos. The shoes were smaller than she expected, delicate, almost weightless. And then there was the bracelet. Not just any trinket. Dina Greer had described it in detail, over and over in her original statement: silver chain, pink enamel letters, a tiny ballet slipper charm hanging next to the name. A birthday gift. Marley's favorite. Rivas didn't speak for a long time. The attic was silent except for the hum of the work light and the distant clang of renovation below. It felt unreal. After 9 years of stillness, 9 years of dead ends and dusty reports, the case had moved, not forward, but somewhere. Back at the station, the items were logged and sealed in evidence bags. The photos were taken, fingerprints lifted. Forensics would be slow, decay, dust, years of undisturbed air would work against them. But Rivas wasn't waiting on labs to know what this meant. Someone had placed these things here. Someone had taken the time to fold the costumes, to place the shoes, to tuck the bracelet where it would be seen. Dina was called that evening. She didn't ask questions at first, only listened as Rivas told her about the box, about the attic, about what they found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft, cracking whisper. "You said the bracelet was there?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" "I am." Dina didn't cry. Not then. Her voice steadied as she asked to come see it herself. Rivas hesitated, then said, "I think you should." Outside the theater, storm clouds had begun to gather, casting long shadows over Main Street. Inside, the building groaned with wind and memory. The Grand Aurora was waking up, and it was no longer willing to keep its secrets. Dina Greer stepped through the front doors of the Grand Aurora Theater for the first time in nearly 9 years. The hinges groaned as if recognizing her. The lobby still smelled faintly of old varnish and something sweeter beneath it. Stage dust and perfume, memories baked into the wood. She hesitated beneath the chandelier, her eyes trailing up to the place where the light had once danced during curtain calls. Everything was quieter now, muted like a stage between acts. Detective Rivas met her by the stairs. "You don't have to go up," she said gently. "I can bring the items down." Dina shook her head. "No, I need to see it. I need to stand where they were." The attic groaned under their weight, every step creaking like a question. When they reached the far corner, Rivas pointed to the box. It sat exactly where they'd found it, surrounded by yellow evidence markers and the faint outline of boot prints in the dust. Dina knelt without a word. Her fingers hovered over the costumes, trembling but careful. She didn't touch, just looked. Her eyes found every stitch, every wrinkle, every memory. She leaned closer, whispering their names like she was waking them from sleep. Then she saw it, the bracelet. Her breath caught, sharp and sudden. "That's hers," she whispered. "Marley never took it off, not even in the bath." Rivas stood back, letting her have the moment. There was nothing to say, no comfort to offer that wouldn't dissolve on impact. Dina sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest. The attic felt smaller now, air thick with grief, and something else, recognition. This space had held her daughter's last known belongings. Someone had put them here. Someone had climbed into this attic, carrying 2 costumes, 2 shoes, and a bracelet. And they hadn't tossed them. They'd arranged them. Not with cruelty. With care. "Why here?" Dina murmured. "Why now?" Rivas didn't answer. But she was thinking the same thing. The box wasn't a clue. It was a message. And it meant that someone, somewhere, had kept a piece of the girls all this time, hidden and waiting to be found. Detective Rivas didn't sleep that night. Not really. Her mind replayed every detail of the attic discovery, the way the costumes had been folded, the position of the shoes, the delicate placement of the bracelet. It didn't feel like a discard. It felt ceremonial, intentional, and that was what unsettled her most. By sunrise, she was at her desk, reopening the original case file. The documents were yellowed at the edges, the photos black and white from the old copier. She read through every interview from that first night in 1988. Ushers, stagehands, parents, volunteers, so many voices, none of them adding up to a single clear path. And then she saw it, an offhand comment from a theater custodian named Lionel Deeks. "Those girls were always poking around backstage. There's a crawl space behind the dressing rooms. You can fit through if you're small. They like to hide there sometimes." Rivas had skimmed it before. It sounded harmless, a footnote. But now, with the box found in the attic, hidden, high, and out of reach, it didn't feel so harmless anymore. She grabbed her coat and headed back to the theater. The crawl space wasn't marked on the original floor plan. It took 2 workers and a flashlight to locate it, an old wooden panel behind the second-floor dressing room mirror, loosened by decades of neglect. Rivas crouched and peered into the narrow passage. It smelled of sawdust and mildew, the air stale and unmoving. Someone had crawled in here once, maybe more than once. She shined her light ahead. The space ran deeper than expected, angling upward behind the wall structure, a hidden spine inside the building. And then something caught her eye. A candy wrapper. Old, faded, the foil barely visible in the dust. She reached for it, heart quickening. It was the kind sold in bulk bags, wrapped but unlabeled. Cheap, easy to hand out, easy to offer to a child. She turned to the foreman. "Has this space ever been searched?" He shook his head. "Not that I know of. No reason to." Now there was a reason. Rivas stared into the darkness beyond the panel, a feeling rising in her gut, familiar, cold, and sharp. Someone had known this place. And someone had used it. The crawl space led into a part of the theater no one had thought about in years, an unused section between the walls, above the dressing rooms, where time seemed to stall. Rivas moved carefully, her flashlight beam dancing across the cramped wooden tunnel. The space was barely 3 feet tall, lined with exposed nails and crumbling insulation. But it was what she saw near the back that made her freeze. A flattened cushion, a rusted flashlight, and scrawled into the wood with what looked like a nail, 3 jagged letters. T+M. She knelt, examining the markings. The carving was shallow but deliberate, fresh enough to have happened not long before the girls vanished. Tessa and Marley. Their names, etched into the hidden bones of this building like a whisper only the walls could hear. Beside the cushion, a second candy wrapper lay half-folded, along with a brittle piece of ribbon, lavender, frayed at the edges. This wasn't just a hiding spot. It had been a place they returned to. The implications sent a cold ripple through her chest. The twins had known about this space, maybe even played here, but they hadn't been alone. Someone else had known too, someone who had the time, the trust, and the opportunity to draw them in and keep them hidden. Rivas took photographs, bagged the items, and backed out slowly. She called forensics. Then she called Denna. "I found something," she said gently. That afternoon, Dina returned to the theater for the second time in 2 days. She stood beside Rivas, outside the open panel, peering into the dark passage where her daughters might have once crawled, whispered, hidden. When Rivas showed her the ribbon, Dina covered her mouth and nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheek. "That was Tessa's," she said. "She wore it that night." They didn't speak for a while. The air felt heavier here, like the building was holding its breath. Rivas didn't rush her. She knew what this meant, for the case, for Dina, for everything that had been buried since that night. The theater was starting to speak. Not in full sentences yet, but in fragments. And, for the first time in 9 years, someone was finally listening. His name hadn't meant much at the time. Harold Vint, stage manager, employed part-time by the town to oversee productions at the Grand Aurora Theater in the late 80s. His interview had lasted less than 15 minutes back in 1988. He'd been polite, cooperative, said all the right things, claimed he clocked out before the girls disappeared, left through the front doors, didn't see anything unusual. Nothing about him stood out. No record, no complaints, no red flags. But now, with the crawlspace discovery and the costume box found in the attic, both accessed through areas only a handful of people would have known existed, his name surfaced again. This time, Rivas looked closer. Harold had access. He'd been there that night. And, most notably, his time card had been manually adjusted, clocked out at 8:53 p.m., but 2 other staffers remembered seeing him still backstage closer to 9:15. No one had thought much of it back then. Things were chaotic, time blurred, but now it mattered. Rivas found him living in a modest trailer just outside Aurora Falls, tucked behind a row of skeletal pine trees. The mailbox still bore his name, crooked and faded. He answered the door in a threadbare sweater, his hair thinner, grayer, but his eyes sharp and alert. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "You're here about the twins," he said, voice flat. Rivas nodded. "You remember that night?" "Every second." She asked to come in. He didn't invite her, but he didn't stop her either. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and dust. Theater programs lined the wall, curling with age. A framed photo sat on the mantel, Harold, younger, standing beside the Grand Aurora marquee. His smile looked tight, uncomfortable, like someone holding a secret in their teeth. She asked again about his timeline that night. He rubbed his chin, blinked slowly. "Like I told them before, I left after the curtain dropped, didn't see the girls leave, didn't know anything until the next morning." But his fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest. A steady rhythm. Not nerves. Something else. A pattern. Rivas leaned forward, quiet. "You ever go up to the attic, Harold?" He looked at her, jaw stiff, eyes narrowing just slightly. And then he lied. No reason to. The prop room had been locked for nearly a decade, its heavy door sealed shut with rusted hardware and 2 layers of caution tape that had long since faded to a pale gray. Most people had forgotten it was even there. Tucked behind the orchestra pit, near the old trapdoor mechanism, it had once stored backdrops, broken stage equipment, and costume racks that hadn't moved since the late 70s. But now, with a fresh key in hand, and Harold Vint's name quietly climbing the list of persons of interest, Detective Rivas stood at the threshold of the forgotten room, the air around her thick with anticipation and mildew. The locksmith's tools clicked softly as he worked, then gave a satisfied grunt as the final pin aligned. The door creaked open. Inside, it was dark, the smell of rot sharp and immediate. The single bulb overhead flickered when she pulled the chain, revealing a cluttered space frozen in time. Rolled-up set pieces leaned against the wall. A headless mannequin stood in the corner. Dust hung in the air like ash. But it was the far beam that drew her eye. Wrapped loosely around the exposed wooden post were 2 pieces of faded ribbon, one pink, one lavender, tied in uneven bows. Age had drained them of color, but not of meaning. Rivas moved closer, heart pounding. The ribbons weren't just discarded. They had been placed there, carefully, deliberately. A gesture, a signal, a relic. She took a deep breath and crouched near the base of the beam. Something glinted in the dust. She brushed it away to reveal a tiny, rusted music box, no larger than a fist. The kind sold at drugstores, shaped like a star. When she turned the key, it wheezed out the opening notes of a lullaby before catching on something and going silent. She stood slowly, the box cradled in her hand. This room, hidden, sealed, ignored, had held a piece of the story all along. She looked back at the door. Only a handful of people had keys in 1988. Fewer still had a reason to go inside. And at least one of them had never let go. The old electrician didn't think much of it when Detective Rivas showed up at his shop. He was retired mostly, half-blind in one eye and slow with names, but when she mentioned the Grand Aurora Theater, his shoulders stiffened slightly. "Yeah, I remember it," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Wired half that place myself in the 70s. What about it?" She pulled out a photo, grainy, low resolution, taken from a VHS tape of the 1988 recital. It showed the main stage, bathed in amber light, just as the Greer twins finished their final spin. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a narrow shaft of light, something that shouldn't have been there. "Was there ever a spotlight in the southwest balcony?" she asked. He studied the photo, then grunted. "Nah, that wasn't wired for lighting. Closest panel's on the other side of the house." "So, what is that light?" He squinted again, slower this time. "Could be the ghost light." She raised an eyebrow. "The what?" "The ghost light," he said, leaning back. "Every theater's got one. A single bulb you leave on after hours keeps the place from going completely dark. Some say it's for safety, some say it keeps the spirits company. Aurora's was old school, ran off a direct breaker backstage. Did it ever flicker?" "All the damn time," he muttered. "Bad connection. I told Harold we needed to replace the wiring in that section, but he never signed off on it. Kept saying the budget wouldn't allow it." Rivas paused. "So the light could have flickered, even failed, the night of the recital?" He nodded slowly. "Could have gone pitch black in parts of that building if the breaker hiccuped." She thanked him and left, the answer tumbling in her mind. If the ghost light failed, even for a few seconds, it would have left entire backstage corridors in darkness. No security cameras, no lighting, just shadows. Perfect conditions to disappear. And if someone knew when that breaker was vulnerable, someone who had access to the fuse box, who had ignored repeated repair requests, who stayed behind after the curtain fell, then the darkness hadn't been an accident. It had been planned. The old recital programs were brittle and sun-faded, stored in dusty boxes in the back room of the local library, their corners curled from years of being forgotten. Rivas spent hours flipping through them, page by page, scanning names, roles, acknowledgments. Most were predictable: parents, volunteers, town council sponsors. But in the 1988 program, at the very bottom of the special thanks section, a name stood out: Wade Tarrin, volunteer security coordinator. It hadn't come up in the original files. There was no interview on record, no contact information, just the name, nestled between a florist and a local bakery. She ran it through the department's archives. Nothing. Then the DMV. One expired ID, issued in early 1988, address listed as a temporary residence, no further renewals, no tax record. Nothing after that year. She drove to the listed address, an old boarding house on the south edge of town, now boarded up and hollowed out by time. A neighbor across the street remembered him. Tall, kept to himself. Moved in that spring, gone by summer. He worked over at the church some nights, the man said, that basement shelter they used to run, took in the drunks and the lost souls, quiet guy, real polite. Rivas visited the church next, though it was more community center than sanctuary now. In the basement, stacked behind folding chairs and dust-covered hymnals, she found what she was looking for, a faded logbook from 1988, listing volunteers who helped run the temporary shelter. Wade Tarrin's name appeared 9 times in June. The last entry was dated 2 days after the girls vanished. Next to that final entry, in a different pen, someone had scribbled, "Gone north, left no address." She stared at the page for a long moment. Tarrin hadn't been interviewed. He hadn't been tracked. He had slipped through the cracks, a man trusted with keys and access, thanked in the very program that celebrated the night the Greer twins disappeared. And now, 9 years later, his name had resurfaced, just as the theater began to yield its buried truths. Someone had moved in the dark that night. And his trail was no longer cold. The church basement hadn't changed much since 1988. The floors were still scuffed linoleum, the smell still a mix of bleach and coffee grounds. Folding tables lined the walls, and a battered bulletin board displayed outdated flyers for food drives and AA meetings. But down a narrow hallway, past the old furnace room, was a locked storage closet. The pastor, a kind-eyed man who'd only been a teenager when Wade Tarrant volunteered here, opened it for Rivas without hesitation. "Back then," he said softly, "we didn't ask a lot of questions. If someone wanted to help, we let them." Inside the closet were cardboard boxes stacked chest-high, full of donated clothes, blankets, and forgotten supplies. Rivas crouched and began sorting, unsure what she was even hoping to find. After 15 minutes, she opened a box labeled Toys, 1980s. At the bottom, beneath a cracked Etch-a-Sketch and a pile of threadbare stuffed animals, lay a pink plastic hairbrush. It was small, child-sized. A name had been scratched into the back in uneven block letters. Tessa. Her hands went still. She showed it to the pastor, his brow furrowed. "I remember," he began. "There was a night. Must have been a day or two after the recital. Wade came in late, real quiet. He was carrying something, blankets maybe? I remember seeing 2 kids with him. Thought they were his." Rivas felt her pulse quicken. "Did you talk to them?" He shook his head. "Not really. One of the girls wouldn't look at anyone. The other kept holding her hand. They didn't stay long, maybe an hour. Then Wade said he was taking them to a friend's up north. We never saw him again. No incident report, no police tip, just a passing moment in a space that wasn't built to remember." Rivas stepped back into the hallway, the brush still in her hand. She stared at it, pink, faded, unmistakable. The twins had been here. Alive. After the recital. After the search began. And they hadn't been alone. She didn't know yet where Wade had taken them next, or why he'd kept them hidden, but he hadn't just disappeared. He'd moved them one step ahead of the world. Until now. The attic gave up one more secret. It happened 2 days after the discovery of the costumes. A volunteer electrician was running new wiring through the upper crawlspace when he knocked against a thin panel at the rear of the attic's north wall. It shifted slightly, revealing a sliver of hollow space behind it. He called for Detective Rivas. The wood was dry and brittle, and with careful hands, they peeled the panel back to reveal a narrow compartment, no wider than a cupboard. Inside, stacked tightly, were a handful of small belongings. A cracked snow globe, a worn-out flipbook, hand-drawn with pencil stick figures dancing, a broken plastic comb, and nestled underneath, a cloth-bound notebook. The cover was blue. The pages inside were fragile. Written in a small, unsure hand were words that stopped Rivas cold. June 12. I don't know where we are. Marley is trying not to cry. He says we're going to be stars in a new show. I don't want to be a star anymore. Each entry was short, often disjointed. They didn't use names, but the voice was unmistakably that of a child. Descriptions of a dark room, of whispering late at night, of singing songs to keep from falling apart. One line repeated, over and over, like a mantra. Marley says Mom will come. She always comes. There were only 4 entries. The last was dated June 15. After that, the pages were blank. Rivas closed the notebook slowly, as if it might shatter in her hands. She looked around the attic, now brighter with the new wiring, but still heavy with memory. This wasn't just a storage space. It had been a hiding place, a holding room, a prison. And someone had taken the time to preserve these artifacts? Why? A memorial? A confession? Or something more sinister? Downstairs, crews continued restoring the theater, unaware of what the walls had held all these years. Riva stood at the edge of the attic, the notebook against her chest, and let the silence settle again. Tessa had written those words, which meant, at least for a few days, they'd both still been alive. The file came from a forgotten box in county storage, records from a fire investigation in 1990, logged under forest incidents. A remote cabin, burned to its foundation, up in the hills near Black Hollow Pines. No survivors. One body recovered, badly burned, presumed to be the property's squatter. No dental records matched. No name was ever confirmed. The case had been closed with a shrug and a storage label. But one detail changed everything. The report listed a recovered metal lockbox found near the hearth, partially melted but still intact. Inside, personal belongings, photographs, and a child's necklace, plastic, rainbow-colored beads, one letter per charm. The name spelled out was Marley. Rivas held the report in her hands, her breath locked in her chest. The contents had never been cataloged beyond a basic description. No connection had been made, no dots drawn between a fire in the woods and two missing girls from a recital 2 years prior. She drove out to the station that held the evidence, 3 hours northwest, a town even smaller than Aurora Falls. The lockbox was still in their archive, wrapped in brown paper, tagged and sealed. When the tech opened it, the hinges groaned like they hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the necklace sat coiled like a memory. Beneath it, faded Polaroids. Rivas picked them up, one by one. Her fingers trembled. 2 girls, sitting on the edge of a cot, thin, pale, tired. In one photo, the taller girl had her arm around the other. In another, they were holding hands. No smiles. Just wide eyes, and the weight of something no child should have known. Rivas turned over the final photo. A date had been scribbled on the back, August 9, 1989. That was more than a year after they disappeared. And it confirmed what Dena Greer had believed all along. They hadn't died that night. They'd been taken, hidden, moved from place to place. Until someone, likely Wade Tarrant, had holed up in that cabin, far from anyone who might come looking. Rivas looked down at the last photo again. The younger girl leaning slightly into her sister. Still together. Still alive. For how long, she didn't yet know. The photograph made headlines again. For the first time in nearly a decade, the case was back on the front page. 2 girls, their names whispered with equal parts sorrow and disbelief, now frozen in time inside a Polaroid. Rivas released the image to a national missing persons database, along with the detail about the fire and the suspected identity of the man in the cabin. Public response was immediate. But what caught Rivas's attention wasn't a call from law enforcement or a long-lost relative. It was a nurse. She worked at a now-shuttered psychiatric facility in northern Idaho. She recognized the girls, or at least one of them. In the summer of 1994, a young woman had been brought in by local police after being found wandering the outskirts of a highway rest stop. No name, no ID, no history. She spoke little, but when she did, she said things like, "We used to dance," and "My sister stayed in the fire." They'd called her Jane Doe. She stayed in their care for a year. Then, after a bout of severe pneumonia, she died in 1995, no next of kin, buried in a state lot under a number. The nurse had kept one file photo from her time there, against policy, but something about the girl had haunted her. Rivas received the image by fax. It was grainy, but enough. It was Tessa. Older, gaunt, her eyes sunken, but unmistakable. Even her posture, the way she held her arms tightly to her sides, matched childhood photos. She had survived the fire. For at least 5 more years, she had lived in shadows, lost and unrecognized. Rivas closed the file slowly. She had confirmation now, at least part of it. Tessa had lived. She had escaped, somehow. And in her final days, she had spoken of her sister, of dance, of a fire. The weight of it settled heavy in Rivas's chest. She picked up the phone and dialed Dena Greer. When Dina answered, her voice was thin, tired. "Is it them?" she asked. "Yes," Rivas said quietly. Tessa made it out. There was silence. And then the quiet sound of a mother breaking, grief and relief tangled in a single breath. The grave was marked only by a number. No name, no date of birth, no epitaph. Just a cold metal plate driven into the soil of a state cemetery in Idaho, surrounded by other forgotten markers, each one signifying a life that had slipped between the cracks. Rivas stood at the edge of the plot, the wind tugging gently at her coat, the mountains in the distance hazy with late summer heat. She had driven through the night to be here, not because she needed to see it, but because someone had to. Someone had to stand in that lonely space and say her name aloud. Tessa Greer. It felt wrong that the girl who once danced in pink satin and lavender ribbons should rest in a place so unremarkable. But it was all that remained. Rivas pulled a small object from her coat pocket and knelt, Tessa's music box, recovered from the prop room weeks earlier. It no longer played, the spring too rusted, the gears too worn. But that wasn't the point. She set it gently on the ground. Across the country, Dena Greer waited by the phone. She hadn't flown out, her grief too raw, her body worn down by years of not knowing. Instead, she asked Rivas to call when she reached the site, to read something for her. Rivas unfolded the note. "To my beautiful girl. You were brave, you were kind, you were everything I hoped you'd be. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, but I will carry you with me always. Love, Mom." Rivas read it slowly, letting the words settle into the quiet. No music, no eulogy, just the wind and the soft click of the cemetery gate closing in the distance. Tessa had lived in the shadows for too long. She'd wandered through silence, remembered only by one nurse who saw more than paperwork. Now, finally, she had a name again. A story, a voice. And somewhere, out there, was the last piece still missing. Because Marley hadn't been found, not in the cabin, not in the files, not in any grave. And until she was, the story wasn't over. 9 months after the costume box was discovered, the Grand Aurora Theater reopened its doors. The walls had been repainted, the seats reupholstered, the chandelier restored to its original brilliance. On opening night, the marquee glowed once more, just as it had in 1988. But this time, the name above the arch wasn't a play. It was a dedication. For Marley and Tessa Greer, forever dancing. Dena Greer sat in the third row, the same seat where she'd watched her daughters take the stage for the last time. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, a lavender ribbon tied gently around her wrist. She hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't granted interviews, but she had come here, quietly, to witness what they'd made of the place that had taken everything from her. The tribute performance began with no fanfare, just a single dancer stepping onto the stage in a soft pink costume, her movements light and deliberate, tracing the steps Marley and Tessa had once practiced on their living room floor. Then another dancer joined, then another, all children, all girls from the town. No words were spoken, no narrator explained, but somehow everyone understood. The town had changed, the pain had not vanished, but it had found shape, a place to be held. And in this act of remembrance, something long frozen began to thaw. After the curtain call, Dena rose from her seat and walked slowly to the stage. She didn't speak. She simply placed 2 roses on the wooden floor, one pink, one lavender, and stepped back into the dark. Outside, under a pale spring sky, the building stood tall again, whole. But it would never be innocent. The investigation remained open. The search for Marley continued. No body had ever been found, no confirmed sightings since the cabin. But Rivas believed, quietly, stubbornly, that someone, somewhere, still knew more. A neighbor, a witness, maybe even Marley herself. Hope, in its most fragile form, persisted. Because once, 2 sisters danced beneath those lights. And now, even in silence, even in loss, their footsteps still echoed, soft and steady, across the stage.